Okay. Thank you. Although usually I'm loud enough that the amplification doesn't matter. It might be too loud now. Before we begin, I want to go through a few audience behavior guidelines. The University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee embraces the principles of free speech and the resulting free exchange of ideas to assure that the speaker can be heard, the audience can hear and see, and that the event is safe. The following guidelines have been set by the UWM administration in accordance with the Wisconsin Administrative Code. First, audience members must remain seated. We have to keep all aisles, exits, and passageways clear. Secondly, we ask that there be no sticks or standards, no signs supported by sticks or standards shall be permitted in the assembly building. Third, we ask that there be no visual obstructions, no activities or signs that obstruct the view of the audience shall be permitted. Fourth, verbal or sound demonstrations are to be kept to a minimum. Noise levels that impede the program's progress or the audience's ability to hear shall not be permitted. 5, objects may not be thrown. I hope that's uncontroversial. And finally, we ask that any behavior that infringes on the safety of others or endangers university property won't be permitted. So I don't anticipate we're going to have problems with this, but we appreciate your cooperation. We're very pleased that you're all here for tonight's event. This is an event that is being sponsored by the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. And so to talk a bit more about that and to welcome Professor Kearney, in just a second we'll welcome Alexander Tak on the stage. He is the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership and an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research and teaching interests are in the fields of American politics and statistical methodology. Professor Tak completed his doctoral work in political science at Stanford University, where he also received a master's degree in statistics. He received his undergraduate degrees in mathematics and political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His work has been published in major research publications such as the American Political Science Review, Political Analysis, State Politics and Policy Quarterly, Public Opinion Quarterly, Social Influence, and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. He also serves as a faculty affiliate with the University of Wisconsin Law School and an honorary fellow in its Institute for Legal Studies. So I'm very happy to welcome Professor Tak to the stage.
Thank you, and good evening. I'm Alex Tak. I'm the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. And the Thompson Center has been delighted to be able to sponsor tonight's event and to work with UW-Milwaukee to make this event possible. I want to thank Dr. Kearney, the UW-Milwaukee Department of Economics, everyone at UWM, and the Thompson Center who has made this event possible. Let me briefly explain what the Thompson Center is for those who may be unfamiliar with it. The Thompson Center was founded to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues from both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. It seeks to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy. In seeking to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy, the Thompson Center works to foster effective public leadership by offering events such as this, funding research and scholarships, and conducting other activities across the UW system. According to Pew, 23% of children in America today, nearly 1 in 4, do not live in a two-parent household. This is higher not only than in the past, but than in any other country in the world. Compare the 23% of children in the US to 15% in Canada, 12% in Germany, 7% in Japan, and 3% in China. Perhaps this is not consequential, at least for society at large. But if it is consequential, it affects the US like never before and like nowhere else. So I think it's important to understand whether, and if so, how, two-parent households matter. Fortunately, tonight's speaker is a renowned economist who has taken a careful look at exactly this question. Melissa Kearney is the Neil Moskowitz Professor of Economics at the University of Maryland, director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. She's also a scholar affiliate and board member at the Notre Dame Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities, an editorial board member at the American Economic Journal, Economic Policy, and the Journal of Economic Literature, a former co-editor of the Journal of Human Resources and senior editor of Future Children, and a scholar affiliate at MIT's Abdul Jamil Poverty Action Lab. She serves on the board of MDRC and the board of governors of the Smith Richardson Foundation. Previously, she was director of the Hamilton Project at Brookings from 2013 to 2015 and co-chair of the JPAL state and local initiatives, local innovation initiatives from 2015 to 2018. Dr. Kearney received her bachelor's degree in economics from Princeton University and her doctorate in economics from MIT. Go Engineers, where she studied on an NSF graduate student fellowship and a Harry S. Truman Fellowship. Dr. Kearney's academic research focuses on domestic policy issues, especially issues relating to social policy, poverty, and inequality. She has published widely in top economics journals and is frequently cited in the popular press. She has testified before Congress about U.S. income inequality. And her recent book, The Two-Parent Privilege, How Americans Stopped Getting Married and Started Falling Behind, has been called, quote, the most important economics and policy book of this year. Please welcome Dr. Kearney.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm honored to be here. I appreciate the gracious hosting of the Tommy Thompson Center and UW-Milwaukee. I understand that for some of you this is date night, and I am flattered, and I hope it delivers. So I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It's something that I've become very convinced is critically important to conversations about child well-being, income inequality, and class gaps in U.S. society. So let me start with motivation for why I wrote this book. I'm not somebody who has spent my career as a marriage promoter or Republican propagandist, despite what some recent editorials have referred to me as. Okay, but the truth is I've spent over 20 years studying inequality and social mobility in America. And time again, in study after study, we see the importance of family structure to kids' outcomes. And as I'm going to show you in the data, we see a wide divergence in family structure for kids in this country that's contributing to inequality and social mobility. But in my experience over the past 15 years of being in a lot of conversations among policy advocates, policymakers, economists who weigh in on policy topics, we talk about addressing inequality and social mobility in America, and we focus on the same set of issues. We focus on the need for a stronger government safety net, which I subscribe to and I've advocated for. We focus on the need for improved schools. Again, something I think is critically important. We talk about the need for affordable housing, for college tuition and access, for criminal justice reform, for stronger labor market institutions, for progressive tax reform. All things that I've written about I think are really important. But in my experience, the most critical factor driving kids' outcomes, the need for stronger families, is something that always got short shrift in these conversations. And so, in my telling of this, it always felt like the elephant in the room. It wasn't that people didn't know it was important. It was just something that was sort of considered out of bounds for our policy, wonky economics conversations. And I think generally that reluctance to talk about the need for stronger families, to talk about what's happened to families in America, comes from a good place. It's a well-intentioned desire to not sound like we're judging people. We certainly don't want to come across as blaming the victim. I also think it reflects the fact that we don't really, as economists or policy experts, know very well what to do about it. It's a lot easier to talk about ways to make the tax code more progressive or to make even, housing more affordable. It's a lot harder to think about how to strengthening families. But I've become convinced that we can't have an honest or productive conversation about social mobility, child well-being, class gaps if we don't talk about the topic of the need for stronger families and figure out what to do about it. So that's what the book is about. That's what I'm going to be talking about this evening. I just want to start with some level setting. Just what has happened to children's living arrangements in this country. So what I'm showing here, this is all data from the US Census. It's a snapshot in time. The share of US kids living with married parents fell from 77% in 1980 to 63%. And you can see in the top line of the figure that most of this reduction occurred in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and then it seems to have stabilized. So it doesn't suggest the trends, if we extrapolate out, doesn't suggest it's necessarily going to get lower, but there's no suggestion that it's going to increase either. This looks like sort of we've settled at this place where only 63% of kids are living with married parents. Really importantly, this has not been made up for by a share of kids just living with two parents who are essentially cohabiting in a long-term stable relationship in what looks like marriage but isn't legally marriage. That's not what's happened. Instead, now roughly 30% of US kids live outside a two-parent home. About 21% live with an unpartnered mother, about 4.5% live with an unpartnered father, and another roughly 4.5% live with neither of their parents. Only 8% of US kids at a given, in recent years at a snapshot in time live with cohabiting parents. And what that means in the census is that kids live with one of their biological parents and their parents' unmarried partner. And in about, a quarter to 40% of those cases, that unmarried partner is not the child's second biological parent. So even that 8% overstates the share of kids living with their two parents. So we're really in a situation where a very high share of kids are living outside a married parent home in the US. As was already alluded to, this is a particularly US phenomenon. Okay, so 23% of US kids by the Pew methodology live in a single parent home, more than in any other country for which there is data. And my view of this is not US exceptionalism of which we should be proud. Okay, so our kids in this country are at a really elevated risk of living with only one parent as compared to their counterparts around the world. One reaction, sanguine reaction to this might be, well, of course American women are more financially independent, more economically successful, better able to afford this than in other countries. And so it's really, really critical that we realize that it's not the most economically successful women in US society who are doing the hard job of raising kids in a house by themselves. So what I'm showing you here is what I refer to as the college gap in married parent families. So again, this is from US Census data, the percent of kids living in married parent homes by the mom's education. The share of kids living in married parent homes among those who are born to a mom with a four-year college degree has remarkably only fallen by 6 percentage points over this 40-year period. And part of what makes that so remarkable is that the share of moms who have a four-year degree has grown so much. It was 11% back then, now it's 30%. So it's a bigger group, it's a more varied group, and yet marriage among that group of moms is holding very steady. It's outside the college-educated class that we've seen this really large drop in kids living in married parent homes. So if you look back in 1980, there wasn't that much of an education gradient. Even among moms without a high school degree, those were largely teen moms, the most vulnerable moms, 80% of them were married. Now among that group, it's only 57%. And then I think the really underappreciated story of what's happened is this massive decline in the share of high school educated moms who are married, 83% to 60%. That's a 23 percentage point gap. That's really consequential. And so whereas in the 80s, there was a literature of people starting to worry about the high rates of single motherhood among the most disadvantaged groups of women, it was 20 to 30%. Now the story is really the advantage or the privilege of college-educated mothers and their children. That's the group that stands apart now, right? It's not that the most disadvantaged are standing apart. You see the gap is really the college-educated and everybody else. To be clear, cohabitation does not close this gap. So if we look at it, not by marriage rates, but the share of kids whose moms are unpartnered, that share is 12% among the children of moms with a four-year college degree, and it's 29 and 30% among the other groups. There's also a race and ethnic element to this divide. And so it's very much a story of race and ethnic group cross-education groups in the US. Interestingly, or consequentially, what has happened over the past 40 years is the emergence of this college gap among white families, among black families, among Hispanic families, not among Asian American families. So if you just look across the bars here, I'm showing you in the first set of bars, this college gap among the children whose moms identify in the census as white. 88% versus 69 and 60%. So a large class gap within that racial group. Among Hispanic moms, 76% versus 59 and 59. Among the children whose moms identify in the census as black, the shares of those children living with married parents is twice as high among those whose moms have a four-year college degree, 60% versus 31 to 30%. And then interestingly, among Asian Americans, there's really not an education gap. Two-parent households are very high among all levels of education for that ethnic group in the census. In the 1980s, there was the emergence of a black-white gap in family structure. This started happening in the 60s and 70s, and a number of scholars started writing about the black-white differences in family structure at that time. The story that I'm really focusing on the book is what's happened in the 40 years since, where you see for all groups, the share of kids in married parent homes has declined, and that has been driven by non-college educated parents. Okay, so in all groups, this emergence of a college gap is a fairly recent phenomena of the past 4 decades. As a mechanical point, it's really important to realize that this divergence in family structure has amplified household income inequality in this country. So we all know about income inequality. There's lots of talk about income inequality. As labor economists will tell you, and has garnered lots of policy and media attention, over the 80s and 90s and 2000s, college-educated workers have done phenomenally well in the labor market. Their earnings continued to rise. Among those with a high school degree or less, earnings were stagnant or increased a little or decreased a little, depending on exactly how you're looking at the data and what years. The point I'm making in these 3 panels is that those labor market differences have been amplified by these family structure differences. So if you look at the top panel, what I'm showing you there is household income, what has happened to household income over those 40 years in real terms by mother's education level. So college-educated moms, their household income went up by about 60%. For the middle group, it went up by about 8%. For moms with less than a high school degree, if there were 2 parents in the household, it went down by 14%. That's the very familiar story we have from labor economics about what's happened in the labor market, because labor economists like to just focus on workers and holding other changes constant. So if you look at households headed by 2 parents, this is the widening inequality. In the middle panel, I'm just looking at what happened to the income of unpartnered mother households. College-educated moms, unpartnered moms, their earnings and income went up by about 60%. Why? Because all college-educated workers did well over this time, men and women included. The middle group went up by 19%. Unpartnered moms with less than a high school degree, their earnings went up by 24%. So all unpartnered moms are better off now than they used to be. We know this from lots of data. Unpartnered moms are less disadvantaged, they have higher work, they have higher earnings than in the past, okay? Now, let's be clear, their earnings are still roughly half of what 2-parent households are, because in the data, most moms work, and so it's not surprising really that median earnings among 2-parent households tend to be about twice as high as single-parent households. So the trends there are all to the right. Earnings went up, but still pretty low. Now in the bottom panel, what I'm showing you is household earnings from all families with children. So now I'm not conditioning on family structure. What happened to households headed by a college-educated mom? Earnings went up by 55%. Why? Because they're still at pretty much the same rate of having 2 parents in the household as in the past. The middle group, high school educated moms, instead of an 8% increase in household earnings or a 19% increase in household earnings, there's a 4% reduction in household earnings. Why? Because you combine sort of stagnant or small increases in earnings with a 23 percentage point increase in the likelihood that you're the only adult in the home, and household earnings go down. At the bottom, again, it's now a 20% decrease. Why? Because you add stagnant or decreasing earnings with an increase in the likelihood that there's only one adult potential earner in the household. And so at a very mechanical level, this move away from two-parent households has accentuated, exacerbated the economic insecurity of middle-class households in this country. The final sort of big picture point I want to make about these trends is that evidence about what characteristics of neighborhoods are associated with higher rates of upward mobility for kids in those neighborhoods is routinely finding that the share of households headed by married parents or single moms is the largest or among the largest correlate of rates of upward mobility for kids in that household. So here I'm citing work that's come out of this lab from Harvard that has access to all of the confidential tax records of millions of Americans and has mapped social mobility across neighborhoods in the country. And what their results show is that beyond the benefit of having married parents in the household for individual kids, at a neighborhood level, if you're characterizing the places that have the highest rates of social mobility, upward mobility from kids at the bottom of the income distribution, it's not the things that we, again, as economists, have tended to focus on. It's not college tuition, colleges per capita, EITC exposure. Those things are not very highly correlated with rates of upward mobility. It's a challenge to us as social scientists, I think, that the things that are most highly correlated seem to be things that we would set aside as cultural elements, things like the share of households headed by married parents or single moms. Okay, so, that's the sort of lay of the land. There's been a massive change in the way kids in this country are growing up in terms of a very large increase in the share of them with only one parent in their household. This has contributed to inequality in this country across households, and it's had consequences for social mobility. So now I want to, drill in a little bit deeper and just look very specifically as why this matters at sort of a micro level for kids. And the approach I take to this is very much an economic resource-based approach. So I'm not here with a value-laden or moral proposition that married parents are modeling better behaviors for their kids. There's nothing here about spirituality or religiosity. My lens that I take to this is all about resources. And so in my very unromantic economist conceptualization of marriage, what marriage is a long-term contract between two people to pool their resources. I know, such a good date night for you guys, right? To pool their resources and contribute to household production, and when there's kids, the raising of those kids together. Okay, it's a long-term contract to pool resources. And when there's two people in a contract, there are more resources at the household's disposal, at children's disposal, than when there's one parent alone. And so, again, this shouldn't be controversial. There's nothing here suggesting that there's not millions of single moms doing the best they can, loving their kids as hard as they can. It's just pointing out that there tends to be a resource deficit in single-parent homes as compared to two-parent homes. And the data is pretty unforgiving about the reality of this. Okay? And so we just know, and I'm going to run you through some of the evidence, that kids raised by a married couple, and again, why does marriage matter so much? Because I already showed you in the data in the US, it's marriage that delivers two parents to a household for kids. Okay? And so it's not, marriage winds up playing such an outsized role in the story because kids whose parents aren't married are very often only growing up with one parent in their house. It's not just that two parents combine their income, they also provide their, combine their time and emotional energy, and that all matters. All right, so we have mounds of studies, hundreds of studies from across disciplines showing that on average, kids who are growing up in married parent homes have better outcomes. What kind of outcomes do I mean? I mean they're less likely to have behavioral struggles. They're less likely to get in trouble in school. They're more likely to graduate high school. They're more likely to go to college. They're more likely to graduate college. They're more likely to achieve high earnings as adults. They're less likely to be engaged with the criminal justice system. They're less likely to become young unmarried parents themselves. There's mounds of evidence on this. This is really not up for debate. Okay, and nobody who's reacted to my book has suggested that this isn't shown over and over in the data. Where the disagreements come from is what we do about this or how we interpret this, okay? So this is really clear. Now, the gold standard in social science is to have some randomized control trial where you randomly assign people to one situation or another and compare their differences. Obviously, we could never, and we should never have a situation where we randomly assign kids to live with married parents or single parents. And so instead, we rely on the kinds of statistical things that social scientists do to make sure we're comparing things as close as possible. And so even when you're comparing kids whose moms have the same education level, the same race or ethnicity, live in the same place, started childbearing at the same age, we're still seeing differences in outcomes for kids by whether they have married parents or they're living in a one-parent household. So I think the more interesting questions are really, what are the mechanisms delivering those better outcomes for kids? And when, and in what context would the marriage premium, as I call it, be larger or smaller for kids? So of course, again, I'm speaking in generalities here. This is true on average. There's nothing I'm saying that to suggest that in every situation kids would be better off if their parents were married. And certainly there's nothing in what I'm saying to suggest that if there's abuse or violence in the household, kids would be better off if their parents were married. What I'm saying is the data is quite clear that in general, on average, kids do better off if they grow up with the benefit of married parents. Okay. The other thing to think about this is that the benefits of parental marriage, again, what I refer to in some of my work as the marriage premium for kids, is going to depend on the specific context. So think about a single mom. If we're talking about a young teenage mom without a high school degree, what she's able to provide for her child by herself is going to be very different than a mom who's 40 years old with an MBA and a six-figure salary. Right? That second mom is going to be much better off, or much more likely to keep their child out of poverty than the first mom, even without a second adult in the household. But what about the marriage premium? The marriage premium is also going to depend on what the second parent would bring into the household. And so if that teen mom we're thinking about, the father of her child is a teen dad who also doesn't have a high school degree, even if they were together, their kid still might struggle. But what about the mom with a high school degree in some college who's, had children with a man who's a high school degree, maybe some college? They're both making, let's say, $40,000, $50,000. Whether or not they're together in the household could make a real difference as to the neighborhood they live in, whether their child graduates high school. The older mom with an MBA, she probably has enough resources to keep her child out of poverty, get them through high school. But what about getting them through college, which we know is a really hard to obtain outcome? And so I think the way we should think about this is not just on average, but how is it going to depend on the context? And the data is very clear and supports what we would predict in a standard model about how resources matter and how they translate into kids' outcomes. So what I want to show you here, this is from another nationally representative data set, the panel study of income dynamics. What I'm showing you I'm going to give you just two examples of outcomes. And I'm not even doing fancy statistical stuff, which of course we had to do to get this published in an academic journal, but it doesn't really matter after we do our fancy stuff. So I'm just showing you this to give you like the basic, very, very transparent, easy to understand point. I'm showing you here the percent of children who get a high school degree by age 20 based on their mom's education level and whether they're growing up, whether their mom is married or not, okay? Because this is what we have in the data. And so what you see is that the unshaded bars, the share of those kids graduating high school ranges from 68% to 89% by mother's education level. The incremental increase in high school graduation rates is fairly small for the least educated moms and the most educated moms. But consistent with our model or intuition on this, The largest increase in the increment to whether a child graduates high school by age 20 occurs for the moms in the middle, the high school educated, right? And also, of course, that's where the decline has been the largest. So the next outcome I'm going to show you is the percent of children with a college degree by age 25. So in the left, I'm showing you kids whose moms have less than a high school degree. Only 5% of them have a college degree, a 4-year college degree by age 25 if their mom is not married, and only 7% if their mom's married. So there's very low rates of college graduation for kids whose moms have less than a high school degree, whether or not they're married. Really interestingly, the gaps in kids' outcomes grows with the mom's education level. Okay, so for moms with a high school degree, moms with some college, and moms with a college degree, the share of their kids who get a 4-year college degree doubles. It's twice as high if they're married. So what do I make of this? It's not until you have 2 parents with college degrees in this country that a majority of those kids have a 4-year college degree by age 25. It's a really high outcome. And what I think is really important about this is that so much of our conversation about single parenthood has been to date about fighting poverty. We should absolutely be doing more to keep single parent households in this country out of poverty. Let me be very clear on the data on this. Kids who are growing up in single mother households are 5 times as likely to live in poverty as kids in married parent households. Kids in single father households are 3 times as likely to live in poverty as kids in married parent households. We should absolutely be doing more to keep kids out of poverty, okay? But we're never really going to address these gaps in more ambitious outcomes, like getting more kids through college with just a stronger safety net. It takes a lot of resources to give kids that resource-rich home environment that delivers these kinds of high-level outcomes. And so I want us to shift our conversation about family structure from just a narrow focus on poverty to thinking more broadly about class gaps in opportunities, in outcomes, in college completion, and how that perpetuates across generations. Okay, so what are the mechanisms by which married or 2-parent households deliver these better outcomes for their kids? And again, when I say better outcomes, I'm speaking as an economist. These easy to measure markers in data that are associated with educational or economic success. I'm not talking about the things that most of us try to do for our children, which is to make sure they're happy, kind, well-adjusted kids. Okay, so I'm just focusing narrowly on these markers. So what do we know? We know, again, from nationally representative data sets. I'm not giving you just anecdotes here or small sample studies. We know that higher educated married parents spend a lot more money on their kids, right? And what's happened over time is that really advantaged class of married, highly educated parents are spending gobs more on their kids. They spend more on educational activities, on extracurricular activities, all these things such that by the time they get to college application age, those kids have just had all of these resources and experiences poured into them. Okay, so again, this is a mechanism by which that class is sort of pulling apart. The data I'm showing you here on spending on kids, by the way, where you can see the 10th percentile has taken off, this doesn't even include housing expenditures. So if you think one of the main things that parents are doing is spending a lot of money to be in a nice neighborhood with a high test score school district, these understate the point. Okay, we also know from the American Time Use Survey, again, collected by the federal government, of how people spend their time, kids whose parents are more highly educated and are married, those parents are spending more time with their kids. It's true if you just look at the time that married mothers spend with their kid or married fathers, it's more than the unmarried moms or unmarried fathers. And then combine them together, and this is a really big difference in how much parental time input kids are getting from their parents. Again, those of us who have kids, this should feel really intuitive. So a lot of what I'm doing in this book is documenting things that like a normal person would be like, yeah, duh, professor, obviously. And as one single mom said to me when I presented these results to some single parents to say, what do you think? And I think one of the stories she told me, again, it's like she didn't need a professor to tell her that she didn't have enough time to spend with her kids. She was like, yeah, You know, my 9-year-old always says to me, I wish you would get a husband so you wouldn't have to mow the lawn and you could play with me. That's, you know, there's stories behind all of these data points. And so this is just the reality. Again, this isn't a judgment. This isn't a value proposition. This is just the data reflects the reality that one-parent households have less money and less time to spend on their kids. And the final set of resources that I talk a lot about in the book is what I refer to as emotional bandwidth. And different disciplines write about this in slightly different ways. So some behavioral scientists, economists refer to cognitive bandwidth. In the sociology, child development, psychology literature, there's a lot of focus on toxic stress. What study after study shows is that single moms have a lot of stress, limited cognitive bandwidth in their household. Again, that's not a judgment. That's a reality that if you're the only one paying the bills, cleaning the house, driving the kids, you're gonna be stressed out. And then, not surprisingly, it's hard to parent in the way people say they want to parent or development psychologists tell us we're supposed to parent. It's really hard to be stressed at the end of a workday and sit down and patiently read to your child or help them with your homework. So all of that is part of the resource difference that I'm trying to draw attention to. Again, with empathy and with data as something that we should take as a policy challenge, not a cultural war issue. All right, some additional considerations. Does a couple need to be married? No. In theory, in my, again, unromantic, non-religious, resource-based framework of all of this, 2 adults who pool their resources and live together stably through their child's childhood could achieve the same resource-rich environment for their kids. But as a practical matter in the US, that's not what unmarried parents are doing in large numbers. That's why marriage seems to matter. Second, what about biological parents versus other parents? This moves us from a resource perspective to a relationship perspective, which is the purview, you know, sociologists and development psychologists, that's a lot of what they focus on, which is why they'll get impatient with my just, you know, big picture take on this. But what's really important for me is it's not the changing relationship structures of household that's been the dramatic change in the way kids are living in this country. It's just the massive move away from marriage among parents. That means more kids are growing up with one parent in their home. So in my data work, in my book, I treat, you know, same-sex parents the same as married biological parents. It's about 2 versus 1. Okay, finally, what about harmful parents? This gets to the point in the model about what resources would the second parent bring into the house. And if the second parent would bring chaos or violence or things that are harmful for children, then we shouldn't expect a positive marriage premium. Interestingly, there's 2 studies in economics from recent years that have a very careful and creative identification strategy to get at causal effects. And what they find is in the case of children who have a parent convicted of a crime, one is set in Ohio and one is set in the country of Colombia, totally different contexts, both similar methodologies. If that convicted criminal just happens to be randomly assigned to a judge who's more likely to put somebody with that conviction in prison, it seems to be beneficial for the child. So what does that suggest? That suggests that when there's a parent convicted of a crime, it's actually beneficial for the child not to have that parent in the house. And I think what that underscores is that this isn't a statement about in every situation kids would be better. And it's an acknowledgement that in some situations kids wouldn't be better. But those exceptions are exceptions. And again, on average, the data is clear that kids benefit. Okay, finally, 2 points. 1, we have evidence that boys are particularly disadvantaged by single mother family structures. Okay, so the absence of dads in millions of kids' families is not, you know, it's having a detrimental effect on kids, but boys in particular. Again, this is just an unfortunate, uncomfortable finding, but it's very clear from very well done studies. The rise in households without dads has happened at the same time as there's been a rise in the struggles of boys and men in this country. And one of the themes that I'm going to come back to is the reason why it's so important that we address this is because there's a cycle element to it. We've got all these boys growing up without dads, partly because the dads aren't very marriageable, which I'll get to in a minute, but then those boys are going to grow up to not be marriageable, and this cycle is going to repeat if we don't interrupt it. So interestingly, what does the data show about why boys appear to be particularly disadvantaged? Well, Jessica Pond and Marianne Bertrand, in their study, using administrative data on thousands of kids, what they see is that kids, boys who grow up without a dad in the house are more likely to get suspended in school, have all sorts of trouble compared to their sisters, and that gap is wider, right, if there's no dad in the house. So boys are always more likely to get in trouble than girls, okay, in school and that kind of thing, but the gaps are bigger for kids, boys and girls, brothers and sisters growing up in mother-only homes. What they find in the data is that those boys do get less nurturing from their mom, by their mom's own recording of their parenting style. They're more likely to have harsh punishment, get spanked, etc. They're less likely, they get less time on average with their mom than boys in married parent homes. But what the researchers find in their analysis is that actually boys are more sensitive to parental inputs than girls. So how do you think about that as a parent? If I ignore my daughter and I ignore my son is going to be at a larger increased risk of going to school and getting in trouble at recess or doing the kinds of things that are going to get him in trouble and off track. I think it's really important footnote here. This doesn't suggest that girls don't suffer. But if, development psychology literature tells us that when girls are suffering, they're more likely to internalize behaviors. Boys are more likely to externalize. I think that's relevant here because the way boys externalize their struggles gets them in trouble in school, it gets them in trouble with the law. It's more likely to sort of derail their educational and economic trajectories. Okay. Finally, on the issue of boys, what I just described is very micro level data on what's happening in households. Again, going to the lab that uses millions of tax records to trace kids over time and track mobility by neighborhood level. What those researchers have found is that the largest predictor of a smaller gap in adult earnings between black and white boys growing up in the same neighborhood is the share of households in that neighborhood where black fathers are present. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that beyond the benefit of having a dad in one's home, black dads in a neighborhood are very beneficial to black boys. Okay, now the tragedy in their paper, which is shown in an appendix table, is that it's only a very small share of black boys in this country growing up in neighborhoods with low poverty rates and high fatherhood presence. Again, this isn't to blame the moms. It's not to say that there's not millions of single moms doing everything they can. It's to say this is an issue that needs attention so that these boys grow up, to have their best chance of thriving. Okay, what's driving these trends? This is not a story of more divorce. Divorce is down. Okay, what's really interesting is that if you look again in the census at unpartnered mothers' marital status, now a small majority of them have never been married. So this is a big shift from the 80s. In the 80s, 64% of unpartnered mothers were divorced. Now that's 39%. Okay, the small majority have never been married. That used to be only 22%. These rates are particularly high outside the college-educated class. So even among unpartnered mothers, college-educated mothers are more likely to have gotten there through divorce, which actually matters for a resource-based perspective because kids whose parents are divorced are twice as likely to have child support coming into the home. They're much more likely to have engagement with the second parent. So the rise in never marriage is particularly concerning because that's the most disadvantageous situation for kids. Okay, this has happened, across race and ethnic groups, though again, we see, differences. What is driving this sort of increase in the share of parents who have never been married? This is driven by a decline in marriage among adults outside the college-educated class. Again, this is why marriage winds up playing such an important part in the story I'm telling about what's happened to kids. So what I'm showing you here, this is one of the instances where I go back to the 60s and 70s. All of the other graphs have just gone back to 1980. But I think it's really interesting context to look at what happened to marriage rates among adults in the US in the 60s and 70s by education group. During that social cultural revolution, when there were changing expectations about the need to be married, the need to have kids inside marriage, changes about gender expectations, reduction in the institution of shotgun weddings, what we see is that across the education spectrum, marriage rates declined in roughly equal proportion. And then you head into the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, and the decline in marriage essentially stops among the college educated. But it continues a straight line down for everybody else. So this is really important, right? Because this is where the divergence happened. And we see this again here. I'm showing you by education group, cross race ethnic group. For all race ethnic groups, you see these declines are largest outside the college educated class. Okay, so there's various explanations that have been put forward for why this is, why the decline in marriage among non-college educated men over the past 40 years, or non-college educated adults. The first is the marriageable male hypothesis. So the prominent sociologist William Julius Wilson put forward this idea in the mid-1980s when he was calling attention to the divergence in the 60s and 70s in marriage rates and family structure between black and white families. And he created what he called this marriageable male index. And what he meant by that was the share of men in one's race and age group who were employed. Okay? And so what he argued was that the rise in non-marriage among black adults could be explained in a statistical sense by a higher rate of non-employment among black men. And crucially, of course, he acknowledged all of the reasons behind that, right? Systematic racism, struggles in the labor market, all sorts of things. That idea, the marriageable male hypothesis, has been now carried over to not just the race differences, but class differences. Men outside the college-educated class are much more likely to be out of work. They're more likely to have lower earnings. And so in terms of trends, this lines up, and I'll show you that. But also importantly, from well-identified studies that try and get at causal mechanisms, there's reason to believe that there's a causal link here, and I'll talk more about it. A second related but separate issue is women's relative economic position has improved. What does that mean in English? Women can be financially independent and don't have to put up with a non-contributing partner. Okay, so women, one of the papers is even basically called this, like women have become choosier, right? And so there's less of a gain from marriage when women have higher earnings themselves. So we'll come back to that. A third argument, of course, is cultural shifts, just a move away from the importance of marriage, a de-emphasis of family life. And then a fourth explanation that's constantly put out there, but I'm going to suggest isn't very important to the story I'm telling, is that generous welfare has made single motherhood more attractive. And so the way to solve this is to have a more meager safety net. So let me briefly go through these in turn. In terms of I'm just showing you simply transparent to make the point, group level correlation. I'm taking the four race ethnic groups from the census that we've been focusing on and the three major education groups. And if I just plot changes in earnings and changes in marriage rates over this time, what you see is that the groups of men who have had the greatest earnings gains have had the smallest reduction in marriage, and conversely, the men who have done least well in the labor market have had the largest decreases in earnings. So the marriageable male hypothesis lines up with these trends. If we look at women's relative earnings, the groups for whom women's earnings relative to men has increased the most, that's where we've seen the largest reductions in marriage, and that's the high school educated group. College educated women have done really well, but college educated men have done really, really well, okay? And so even though college educated women have done well, they have not increased in a relative sense to the same extent that high school educated women have. And so again, the trends line up. Really important, I show you this because what this shows is that the groups of women who have done the most well, college-educated women, they have experienced the smallest decrease in marriage. So what the data does not support is the idea that, well, gosh darn it, this is all the fault of feminism. And I told you that once women did well in the workforce, marriage was going to decrease. No, that's not what's happened. The groups of women in society, in US society, who have benefited the most from the economic opportunities that have been opened to us by the feminist inroads, we're the ones who are still getting married at the highest rates, who have the benefit of co-parents in our household. And so from an equity perspective, feminists should not be pleased with where we are, because it's the women who are doing less well economically who tend to be finding themselves without a committed co-parent in the home. Okay, there's causal evidence of a link. I go into it in the book. These are really well done studies. They show that exogenous shocks like increased import competition from China that led to a reduction in jobs, a reduction in earnings for non-college educated men in certain communities, very directly and causally led to a reduction in marriage in those communities and an increase in the share of kids in single parent homes. This has been especially true among Black male workers who were hit hard by these shocks. There's other studies showing that the adoption of industrial robots that led to a loss in some well-paying middle-class jobs in certain communities, again, led to a reduction in earnings for non-college educated men and consequently a rise in the share of kids in single mother homes. Namishanov also looks at these industry composition shocks, showing in places where women were in industries that did particularly well, that's where, relative to men, that's where we saw a reduction in marriage. So the economic story, there's a lot of support for this. Unfortunately, work that I've done suggests that now that we're in a new social paradigm, where in many communities and in many parts of the country, non-marital childbearing is quite common, even an increase in male earnings and employment is not going to be enough to really turn things around, okay? So in a study I did with Riley Wilson, we looked at what happened in the rural communities across the country where there were local fracking booms. The local fracking booms, and we don't look at the Dakotas, that's different. You had a whole bunch of migrants coming in. But think about all the other communities in the country. These were really positive economic shocks, not just in the gas and oil extraction industry, but in those local towns that just happened to be sitting on geological formations that allowed for fracking. Male employment went up, male earnings went up in an absolute sense and relative to women. Birth rates went up in equal proportion among married and unmarried adults. No change in marriage, no reduction in the non-marital birth share. That was curious to us. So then we looked back at what happened in the 70s and 80s during the coal boom and bust. Similar communities were hit with this exogenous shock that increased the earnings of non-college educated men. At that time, what happened was an increase in marriage, an increase in married births, a reduction in the non-marital birth share. I think this contrast is really illuminating. It suggests that now, in the 2000s, we're in a different social paradigm than in the 70s and 80s, one where non-marital childbearing, one-parent households are widespread and common, and it means that the way people respond to economic shocks is different. So this is, again, really important to thinking about where we go from here. Finally, on the role of welfare, we can have a long debate about whether the design of welfare programs between the 30s and 70s that were explicitly conditioned on not having a man in the house led to some of the changes in family structure. But the 1996 welfare reform got rid of those terrible incentives, made it harder to get cash welfare, had explicit programmatic designs to reduce teen childbearing and non-marital living arrangements. And so now I think it's just really a misread of the situation to suggest that the way to turn things around is by making welfare even harder to get. And so I very much come down very clearly and normatively in favor of not making our social safety net even worse for low-income families under this misguided notion that that will lead to more rates of marriage or two-parent households. Okay, this is, I already told you it's not driven by divorce. It's driven by non-marital childbearing, or it's driven by non-married parents, which corresponds to a reduction in marriage. It's also not driven by rising birth rates, Okay, so this idea that, well, teen births in the US are out of control, that's not it. Teen births are down 70% since the mid-90s. In fact, birth rates are down for everyone in the US under the age of 30. So the increase in non-marital births is a bit surprising because it has happened despite the fact that moms are more educated and older now than in the past. So there's been really large reductions in birth rates among younger women who typically had higher rates of single motherhood. So that's why, again, this is really a story about changing marriage patterns. It's happened despite the changes in birth rates. Okay, just to recap, the huge arc that I'm telling based on mounds of data and evidence, 60s and 70s, there were broad changes in social norms and attitudes. Then going into the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, there were a whole bunch of economic forces that drove down the employment and wages for non-college educated men, and as a policy matter, we did not do enough to compensate those groups. This led to a decoupling of childbearing and marriage in affected communities, and now we're in a new social paradigm. And it's going to be challenging to get out of it, but ultimately, I think we cannot resign ourselves to this position. We can't resign ourselves to accepting these really large class gaps in two-parent households, because then we're essentially resigning ourselves to gaps in kids' outcomes. So, to wrap up, and then I'm eager for your questions and comments and observations, what do I conclude from all of this in terms of what do I think can and should be done? First, this is the most controversial position I take in the book. I say as a normative matter, I think we need to foster a norm of two-parent homes for children. And why do I say that? Again, because I just think it's massively important. And we're not going to make up for these gaps even if we manage to expand the child tax credit and give low-income families another $2,000 a year. The resource gaps between one and two-parent households are really large and really beneficial for kids. And so I don't think we can accept a new reality where the two-parent family is yet another advantage or luxury good of the college-educated class. What else do I think we need to do? We definitely need to improve the economic position of men without a college level of education so they view themselves and they are viewed by their partners as more reliable, attractive marriage partners and fathers, okay? Again, I don't think this will be sufficient, but I do think it's necessary. That does not mean we should bemoan women's economic independence. We can hold two thoughts in our heads at the same time. This has been great for women that they are not financially dependent on men who are not reliable providers. It has been really bad for everybody that so many men are not reliable financial providers. Okay, third, I think we need to scale up programs that show promise in strengthening families and improving outcomes for parents and kids. Unfortunately, there are not many I can point to. Why? Because investing in families has not been a policy priority. For 50 years, we've focused on improving schools. We've fought about improving the safety net. We have never had a policy or research or funding commitment to programs that invest in families. The Bush administration ran a couple healthy marriage programs in the 2000s. They did not lead to increased rates of marriage. And so essentially the social policy community decided there was nothing government can do and stepped away from that goal. Hopefully what I'm trying to do in this book, and I've managed to convince you at least a little bit, is this is too important for us to give up on. We have to find the community programs around the country working with families, strengthening families, promoting healthy relationships, and invest in them and scale them up. And finally, as I've already mentioned, there are millions of kids living in under-resourced home situations, disproportionately single-parent households. It would be a colossal failure of our children if we decided to keep benefits to those households meager under the idea that maybe that would force more of those parents to stay or get married. And so ultimately, I think we need to have a stronger safety net for families, all families, regardless of family structure. Okay, I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was great, and I'm eager to hear what comments and questions we have from the audience. I want to maybe kick things off with just one question. It sure seems there's an emphasis that you place on thinking about the economic situations of men without college degrees, how that impacts their success in marriage markets. And you list that as a kind of policy priority of thinking about, what can we do about the economic circumstances of this demographic. And yet it seems some of the evidence that you point out is a bit pessimistic on that in terms of the non-reversibility of this, that the evidence from the fracking booms or the coal booms. Is there something you can point to in that domain that where, what policy levers then do you think are feasible to improve the economic circumstances of that demographic in a way that would actually increase marriageability?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the fracking boom, of course, that was not a government intervention in any way, except, of course, some places allowed fracking and others didn't. It was a shock that improved the economic position of men. And then, the problem, in my view of the situation, is that wasn't enough to lead to an increase in two-parent homes for kids. I think this speaks to the really important role of social norms. And so, again, ultimately, and this is a really strong normative position that I'm taking in this book, ultimately, I do think we need to be honest and upfront as a society in saying that two-parent homes are better for kids. And when that is a feasible household situation, then couples should know that, right? Couples who have kids together should know that. And then the question is, once we acknowledge that, what can we do to help those families achieve that? And so, let me give the flip side of the fact that an economic improvement in the situation of men wasn't enough to sort of lead to an increase in two-parent homes or a reduction in the non-marital childbearing. The government has shifted from funding healthy marriage initiatives to responsible fatherhood programs. So what do these programs do? They're all voluntary. None of them are coercive. Dads, most parents, let's say almost all parents, want to be the best parents they can be, right? So these dads are no different, and a lot of these non-custodial dads avail themselves of the programs to the extent they're offered in their neighborhood of responsible fatherhood programs. They go to a class, essentially a parenting class, how to engage with your child in nurturing ways, what's age appropriate, et cetera. The frustrating thing at the end of the evaluations of those programs is the dads, report, yes, this is how I want to engage with my kid. I know what to do. There's some reduction in mom's level of stress. There's no increase in, ultimately, parents cooperatively co-parenting or the father meaningfully spending more time with the child. So then qualitative researchers have followed up to look at what's going on, and a lot of those dads are struggling with criminal records, lack of employment, untreated mental health conditions, to the extent where teaching dads how to be good dads or convincing them to be engaged dads isn't enough if we don't also address all of the economic and other barriers. And so I really think both things have to go together. Someone just recently sent me a story about a community college in New York that's now running a fatherhood academy. And the website says, if you're a dad between the ages of 18 and 34, come, we're gonna give you sectoral training, we're gonna help you find a job, and we're gonna give you parenting classes. That's the kind of program that I think we need to be investing in and studying and figuring out, how to have holistic, large-scale programs that can help engage more dads positively in their kids' lives.
We have some microphones floating around, and so it would be great to open things up if we have any questions or comments. We'll wait till a microphone comes your way.
Sorry, I can only go so fast. Yeah, no problem. Thank you. I just wanted to thank you for a great presentation. I'm going to be one of those pesky sociologists that's going to maybe push back a little bit. I guess I'm really curious to just hear a little bit more about how you go from the definition of the problem, which I think you laid out really, really well. I think a lot of sociological evidence would also point to especially the class gap, the education gap that you really illustrated for us. Why do you think that promoting marriage, if it's just putting our economics hats on, if it's just about time and money, are there other ways to get kids more parental time and money that don't require marriage? Because it sounds like the marriage piece is going to be really hard. And as a policy intervention, are there more practical ways to provide that kind of support in a way that's going to benefit kids?
Yeah, and just to build on the answer I gave about these responsible fatherhood programs, the programs that intrigue me are really about strengthening families and meeting families where they are. Now, a lot of these couples in surveys and ethnographic evidence that I cite from sociologists tells us that a lot of these couples say they want to be married, but they face barriers in their marriage. So there's nothing that I'm saying we have to promote marriage to people who don't want to be married. But when you have these couples who want to be married, they want to live together, in the Fragile Families Survey, we know a lot of these unmarried couples at the time of the kid's birth, they're optimistic about being married, right? And so then I think figuring out what are the barriers? What are they struggling with that's keeping them from achieving the kind of household structure that they aim for, and what kind of programs can help them? Then I think we can be honest that when there's going to be millions of parents who shouldn't be married, who can't be married, and figuring out ways to encourage healthy co-parenting, right? Fatherhood engagement. I think that's rightly where social policy is trying to move. And so I think it's a bit of a mischaracterization to, there's nothing that I'm saying that's like marriage or bust. I think it's very clear that married parents are the ones who have the highest rates of staying together and contributing to households, and a lot of these couples say they want to be married. And so I just don't think we should lose sight of that or deny that and immediately go to plan B. I do think plan B is, okay, let's help families be the strongest they can be regardless of parental, marriage structure. The other thing that, you didn't go this far, but what some people have said is, why are you focusing on families? These deadbeat dads have nothing to offer their kids, and what you should be doing is using your energy advocating for stronger government programs. I have spent 15 years advocating for stronger government programs, and at some point we need to acknowledge that what we're doing is trying to make up for deficits in the home, and I find the idea that we should give up on non-college educated dads really defeatist and really elitist and pretty hideous, really. And I'm not saying you've said that at all. Some people have, pretty brazenly. And so, again, I'm just, figuring out ways to invest in all parents rather than just thinking that the government can make up for it with more income, I think, doesn't address the range in ways that parents contribute to their kids. And again, I'm drawing on a lot of sociology and psychology literature here to say that parental time with their kid matters a lot. A government check's never going to do that.
I just want to say that I agree with what you have on the do things, foster a norm of two-parent homes, working to improve the economic position, government programs. When I was in high school, I read a book by Kurt Vonnegut, Play Your Piano, and that thing hit me, offered the problems that you have in modern societies in countries like Japan, which I just can't imagine how bad things are going to get when you have a city like Tokyo, 37 million people. This thing about improving the economic position and finding jobs for people, okay, that's true in an urbanized population, in an urbanized setting, whereas if you had a more rural, instead of giving them a job, you could bypass the financial system and and produce the one thing that you need to survive, which is food, and you don't really need money for that. You need money for the tools. And Kurt Vonnegut's Play Your Piano basically describes a society which is very mechanized, urbanized, mechanized, not enough flex hours. Instead of, I don't know about the programs, government programs, but a good government program would be county-owned farms, county-owned car repair shops, so a kid in the 7th, 8th
Yeah.
grade could actually learn how to change brake pads, things like that.
I think you raise a really important observation that there are certain communities that in many ways are left behind, and the challenges facing a lot of rural communities now are a bit different than in urban communities. Interestingly, just as a point of fact, the decrease in two-parent homes for kids among non-BA holders has happened in like strikingly similar proportion in urban and rural areas in the US, and so the rates are now the same. In rural communities, many of which I think you're alluding to, there's a lack of jobs. We also know there's a lot of opioid addiction and, you know, reduction in all sorts of amenities, social benefits, and you know, we know about Case and Deaton stories of deaths and despair. I don't have a good sense of how to draw the arrows, which one's causing which, but I think you're right to point out that all of those sort of social struggles and economic struggles are really tightly entwined.
So maybe if we could have a response to that, and might be.
All right, I'll talk about tax breaks for the rich in some of these areas. I'll tee off that, which is a bit, you know, there is a large effort for place-based policies to restore economic opportunities in these kinds of neighborhoods. This is tangential to my book, but since you teed me up for it, the opportunity zones, which were passed in the last administration, everyone promised those. That's essentially a giveaway to developers to invest in areas that are already on the rise. And I think those kind of programs are not the way to help the truly vulnerable in this country.
Okay, yeah, I think we have a question over here.
Oh, thank you. In Milwaukee, we're quite aware of the unmarriageability of young black men and older black men. And it's been very grievous that we've had mass incarceration for 50 years. We have grandfathers, fathers, and sons who've been incarcerated. And we have the most stringent return policies to the society than we've ever had. There's not a compassion for rehabilitation. They become part of a permanent underclass. So I have nieces and folks that finding marriageable young black men are rare. I want to know what you've looked at in terms of policy to deal with the fact that in the city of Milwaukee, we have rates of black male incarceration the highest in the world, in Wisconsin. We have twice the amount of incarcerated black people in Wisconsin than we do in Minnesota. So, you know, I applaud all of the work that you've done in looking at the variables that sustain poverty, that keep people out of the middle class. The permanent chronic poverty, it's cruel, it's violent. And so as a senior person who's been married 53 years to this man, it ain't been easy, but it's been important. We have 2 black male sons. We have a black male grandson. So, you know, I applaud this work, and I am very interested in whatever we can do to continue to leak with you and the organizations that I'm involved in to do these kind of things to strengthen families. I understand small European countries give money direct to families. I've got friends whose children live in Germany. They give money to families. We give money to agencies who give it to, you know, in bits and pieces. So my question is, have you thought about, and does all of this work include the consideration of incarceration and the abilities to limit to vote, to be able to have the box and you can't get employed, and that just cyclical stuff that you just return to prison?
Yeah.
That's a long way around, but I just wanted to raise it because it's so glaring. It's a big elephant in our Wisconsin room.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those observations. You know, this is why, you know, I share your view on this, that we can't give up on the men, we can't give up on the Black men, we can't give up on men who have been engaged in the criminal justice system, which is why I'm so bullish on this idea that we can't just solve this with, you know, more government support to single moms. This is a crisis affecting everybody. And you mentioned Black dads, grandpas, you know, who are all in prison. One of the reactions I get is, well, grandmas are helping out. But I'm inundated with emails from grandmas who are like, you know, I raised kids on my own. I didn't anticipate being in my 70s now helping my daughter raise her kids. And so I do think this idea that we can just keep helping women and rely on grandmas, I mean, as much as they're all doing, you know, heroic efforts, we do need to help men. The incarceration challenge is real. I actually, you know, I learn about this and continue to learn about this from folks at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The Institute for Poverty Research has been hosting a bunch of webinars on responsible fatherhood programs that's talking about a lot of these challenges facing these men. I suspect you know about their work. It's really illuminating. I've also talked to people who run programs for families who have an incarcerated parent, and there are millions of children in this country who have an incarcerated parent. This is the kind of programming that I think we need to invest in, and we're not investing in it because, again, families aren't a priority. Why would anybody across the political spectrum not think that we should be funding the heck out of these community groups that are helping former prisoners re-enter into society, that are helping families reintegrate a formerly incarcerated parent into their family life? Those programs are funded on shoestring budgets because there's not the money available to help them and to learn what works. And so, you know, I am very much with you, and to, you know, to the extent that my sort of data-driven case can call attention to the kinds of, you know, challenges that you're working on, like, I hope to be part of that solution. I certainly don't have all the answers.
I do have a question on the part about, I've worked in the social services for a while, and it is very common to encounter people that live with a fiance or a partner for many years that don't want to get legally married because they will lose disability benefits. They will lose their Medicaid once their partner's, the male's income is factored into that equation. So I find it hard to believe that that is not a factor, and is there data on that? And secondly, you mentioned earlier that people, they want to get married, these people, but what do you think about the cost of the average wedding? Is $20,000 or more, is that one of the obstacles? I mean, you can always just get married at the courthouse, but is that why people are putting off getting married because of that?
Yeah, so I'm really, really glad you raised this point about marriage disincentives in our tax code. What I meant by saying I don't think it's our overly generous welfare system that's keeping people from getting married. I don't want to suggest that policymakers shouldn't address the marriage disincentives all through the design of our tax code and transfer policies. The Medicaid one is super salient, right? You're a mom, you're making $50,000, you have health insurance for you and your kid, you marry someone making $50,000, you lose Medicaid. That's a big loss. I mentioned this recently when I was meeting with some congressional staffers, and these are hard problems to solve. Like, again, in the old days, AFDC specifically said, you can only get cash welfare benefits if you're not married and there's not a man living in your house. That kind of thing is not explicit now, but when we have a progressive system that's based on household income and you lose your benefits if you're married, there's an implicit tax disincentive. The only way around that is to basically say people qualify for Medicaid by their own earnings, or to make it more universal. I think by drawing attention to the fact that families are important, family structure is important, my goal is to say, can we keep our eye on that when we're designing programs and think about what's happening? So for instance, in Maryland, in the state of Maryland, they're considering a bill tomorrow. I'm presuming it's just a state, but nonetheless, and it's suggesting that in addition to a fiscal impact note on policy proposals, there's a family impact note. But this is the kind of thing we need to be paying attention to. Are we, by the design of our programs, unintentionally discouraging parents from getting married? And you're spot on. Oh yeah, the cost of weddings. A student brought this up for me in our conversation earlier. Anecdotally, I hear it. I have no idea how widespread this is. Matt Iglesias, the journalist, I said this to the student, has suggested that the government offer to pay for like one annual wedding a year or something like that, where people can go get their weddings. I mean, why not try it, right? I mean, people say this kind of thing matters.
Hello. You spoke about the power of social norms and the role it could play in kind of seeing two-parent households as the norm. What do you think about the possible re-stigmatization of single parents that this could lead to, and specifically in the case of single mothers, how that could have an impact on the feminist movement as a whole?
Yeah, so certainly I'm not, and I really don't think any of even the social conservative pro-marriage proponents that I've talked to are suggesting that anyone go back to the days we were stigmatized single mothers and their children such that they're ostracized from society. I think it's an interesting question of how bullish we want to be on stigmatizing absent dads. I'm struck if you go back and read President Obama's 2008 Father's Day speech, he called attention to how many dads were absent from kids' homes and how bad that was for kids. I'm not sure a Democratic leader would give that speech today. As many political advisors have pointed out to me, Obama did not bring that topic up again, right? And so, the pushback of, if you encourage one norm, you're sort of prioritizing a group. I'm a little bit tired of all of our policies and all of our messaging deprioritizing kids. And so if, there's some messaging out there that says, hey, sometimes adult happiness might need to take a back seat to what's best for kids. You owe your child some of your time and attention and money. I'm okay with that, right? Obviously, it's a tough needle to thread when you sort of acknowledge that one family structure is beneficial to kids, doing it in a way that's empathetic to people who find themselves in different situations. I suppose I'm optimistic that we should be able to do that in a way that's honest. So I'll give you a very specific example. There are take time to be a dad messages. They're all over DC. I don't know if they're in Milwaukee. So in the bus stops, there's a take time to be a dad media campaign. Let me be clear. I have no idea if it works. But what is it? It's a picture of a dad having a tea party with his daughter. Picture of a dad, playing t-ball with his kid. That's a positive message, right? That's very different than the campaign that New York City ran over a decade ago, where they put pictures of crying babies on the subway saying, hey, teen mom, now basically my life is ruined. Those are horrible, hideous. Okay, I would never advocate for that kind of messaging campaign, but I think there's a way we could, smart people can come together to have positive campaigns that celebrate the role of two parents in kids' lives.
We have time for one more question, so we will go in the back.
Hi. I thought it was interesting you brought up the fracking. Just anecdotally, I spent a ton of time traveling through Rust Belt, Coal Belt areas of Ohio and West Virginia, and I encountered so many people. As a tourist, I found it virtually impossible to find a hotel room because so many people were being trucked in from out out of state to work in these places, I encountered anecdotally a ton of resentment from locals who had been just laid off from their steel mill. The steel mill had been shut down. We're hoping for some economic impact. It just didn't happen. The issues of marriage this is a new area for me, but it sounds like what you're seeing was that if the economic impact wasn't going to happen in the communities, the marriages weren't going to happen, and stability wasn't going to happen regardless. That's my anecdotal experience.
Yeah, interesting.
Thank you.
There's one more question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me thank you for a fabulous presentation, and more importantly for the hours and hours and hours of work it took you to get to the point where you could give something this insightful. Amazing testimony. Thank you. I'm curious, all Western nations now face a natalist problem as well. And I am curious, at the risk of talking about chickens and eggs and making a bad joke, that will these policies also, or these efforts also likely to address natalist policies? Conversely, have any of the natalist policies that have been adopted, like direct subsidies of children, had any effect on marriage rates in, say, Western Europe, where I know these programs are widespread? Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is a great place to go, I think, for our final question. So for those who don't know the data on this, fertility rates are down basically everywhere in the world other than Africa. They're below replacement. They're falling in the U.S. and in much of Asia and Western Europe. They're below replacement levels. So in the U.S. now, the average U.S. woman will have 1.64 children over her lifetime. We need to be slightly above 2 for the natural rate of population. This is an interesting place where Europe has been leading us. So Europe, Canada, Japan, they've been at below replacement level fertility for a couple decades. So they've been trying all these pro-natalist policies, tax incentives to have kids, et cetera. Even in Scandinavia, where there's essentially cradle-to-grave government support, birth rates are way down, and there's no sign that they're turning around. Japan has quadrupled the share of GDP they've spent on pro-natalist, family-sustaining programs. So their fertility rate seems to have stabilized around 1.4. Not enough to keep the population producing, but it didn't keep plummeting. My read of that, all of the evidence of the sort of pro-natalist, which again really is the form of tax incentives. You get credits if you have kids. In some places, it's you get a larger credit if you have a third kid, paid family leave, extensive family leave. To the extent they have any effect, it's very small. So what's really interesting is we're trying to learn, since this is a new challenge for the US, from Europe. I'm hearing from a lot of sort of demographers, journalists, policymakers in Europe, that the rise in non-marital childbearing in single-parent households is new for them. And so there, it's like, well, my point is look at what's happened to our kids to see what's going to happen over there. It's so in their pro-natalist policies, they have happened in regimes that didn't really have high rates of one-parent households. And so I'm not sure, that we could draw lessons from what it's done to family stability there. I think that, an interesting question for me, I started speculating on this in the book a little bit and ultimately took it out because I can't point to evidence and it's purely speculative. How much the sort of move away from two-parent households and marriage and the decline in childbearing, how much that's all sort of reflecting similar social changes and attitudes about the importance of family life to our orientation of the way we spend our adult years, I think is an interesting question. I know it's not the question you were asking, but I think you're right to sort of think about the changes in birth rates and the change in marriage as part of a cultural phenomenon that's probably related. And I don't have a very good handle on how it's related, but I'm spending increasing amounts of time studying the birth rate changes as well.
All right, we'd like to give a round of applause
Thank
for
you.
Professor Kearney.
Thanks.